In my previous life, I was the commander's wife whom everyone envied. But my husband Mason had his vocal cords and groin injured on the battlefield. He lost his male functions and his ability to speak. So Mason and I lived 40 years of a sexless marriage. I never complained. Without regret I lived as a widow in life, spending half my life with a mute. Until my 60th birthday, when I happened to rummage through his study and found over 500 phone cards. They were all calls to the troops' beauty, someone he loved but could not have. It turned out he wasn't unable to speak, he simply didn't want to speak to me. He wasn't incapable of being a man, he just didn't want to be my man. The blow was so great that I went to my death with bitterness. Then I opened my eyes back in 1984. In this life, I will never suffer wrongs for any man again. The 1980s were a hotbed for entrepreneurship. Riding the spring breeze of reform and opening up, I was going to a city to make my fortune. A city special economic zone was established in August 1980, and it had only been developing for 4 years. Transportation from my hometown to there was not well developed. In those days there were naturally no planes or high-speed trains, we could only take the old green-bodied trains. Not only did I have to transfer 3 times along the way, the earliest train also left on Sunday. I circled a date on the calendar and read. In 5 days, I would leave this remote, backward little mountain village. I borrowed the women's director's bicycle and rode it all afternoon, finally arriving at the station before sunset to buy a ticket. When I turned, I saw Mason, who had just gotten off the train, at the exit. I was reborn, and he was 40 years younger. Tall and upright, with sword-like brows and starry eyes, exuding heroic vigor, he was the youngest Mason in the regiment. His future was boundless. He was also the man I had loved for decades in my previous life. I foolishly convinced myself that as long as we shared the same marriage certificate, we would be a family. Even if he couldn't speak, couldn't make love, couldn't give me a child, I had no complaints. Instead, I used a lifetime of love and passion to care for him, to warm him. The result was that my whole life became a big joke. Seeing me, Mason furrowed his handsome brows. He spoke, somewhat displeased. "Lily, didn't I tell you not to come pick me up?" Only then did I remember that today was the day Mason was coming home from the military to visit his family. At this same time in my past life, I had sent him a telegram. I said we'd been engaged for 3 years, and in the countryside, a woman is considered an old maid at 20. So I told Mason I was going to get married and wanted to follow the army. In the military, once an officer reaches a certain rank, he can have his wife and children join him. They can also get help with employment and schooling for military dependents. For couples who have been separated for a long time, that's the thing they look forward to most. Mason became a Mason last year and qualified to have his family accompany him. I was always hoping he would come and take me away. But he kept refusing. When I grew anxious, I sent a telegram saying that if he didn't come to get me, I would pack my bags and go to his unit to find him. Mason could do nothing but come back begrudgingly, and he even specifically warned me not to meet him at the station. I knew he was deliberately being cold and keeping his distance from me. In my last life I was very sad. I felt like we were already engaged, even if we hadn't registered the marriage or consummated it. In the countryside we were husband and wife. I wanted to be with Mason, hoping we could get the marriage certificate as soon as possible so that when I joined the military I could take care of his daily needs. I also wanted to give him children. But in this life, I've given up the idea of being an army wife. I'm determined to go to City A to strive for a future, and as a result I even forgot about bringing Mason back. I came to buy a ticket to City A, not to pick him up. Mason misunderstood me. Impatience was written all over Qingjuan's handsome face. That impatient? We're still young, there's no need to rush into marriage. Life in the military is hard, following the troops isn't about seeking comfort. If you go, you'll only distract me. I still want to keep improving. Mason spoke, giving reasons why he didn't want me to join the military. I'm not here to pick you up. I also think marrying now is too early, I won't follow the army. My words filled Mason's face with shock. But he immediately let out a mocking laugh. Lily, since when did you learn to advance by retreating? Mason thought I was madly in love with him and simply didn't believe I would give up the idea of following the regiment. I didn't want to explain anything either. 5 days from now I'd be going to City A. After that, the sky will be wide and the earth vast, and there will be no more ties. It's over 20 li from the city to the village. I had borrowed the women's director's bicycle to ride here. On the way back Mason carried me on his bike. He naturally rode faster than I did, but it still took him more than 2 hours to get back to the village. He didn't say a single word to me the whole way. It was an awkward silence all the way. It reminded me of a past life of 40 years of marriage, a loneliness like being mute. By the time we reached the village it was already past 8 at night. The villagers were frugal and unwilling to turn on lights at night, and the whole place was pitch dark. Our arrival set off a chorus of barking dogs. My mother died when I was very young, and my father died saving Mason 10 years ago. All these years I have been living with the Meng family. His parents, Marcus and Martha, were very kind and always treated me with the affection due a daughter-in-law. Seeing us enter, Martha warmed food at the stove while nagging Mason. Boy, you did the right thing bringing your wife into the unit. Being together every day, we'll get to hold a big fat grandson sooner. Mason pressed his lips tight and said nothing. He was a man of very firm principles. In his previous life, because he hadn't married the woman he loved, he would rather have no children at all and let the Meng family die out. Marcus and Martha both passed away with regret. Be nicer to Lily, the Yi family did you a favor. If Uncle Yi hadn't saved you back then, you wouldn't even be alive. What would you be without being Mason? Marcus, seeing his son's impatience, quickly urged. Enough. I already said I'll marry her. Stop forcing me, okay? I'm grateful to Uncle Yi for saving me. But it was just an accident at the time. I'd rather die myself than owe such a huge favor. Let me spend my whole life paying it back. 10 years ago, my father was the militia squad leader in the village. That year a mountain flood occurred, and Mason was swept into the ravine. It was my father who jumped into the water and desperately pulled Mason out, but he himself, exhausted, did not survive. I became an orphan and have lived with the Meng family ever since. Child, from now on you are our old Meng family's own daughter, you are Mason's wife. That promise ruined my whole life. Mason married me because of that promise, but he felt morally coerced. He resented that I had taken over his life and ruined his true love. So even though he'd been married to me for 40 years, he refused to touch me and scorned speaking to me. What's with your attitude? Speak human. You really think that because you're Mason I wouldn't dare to put you in your place? You little brat. Even if you became the commander, I'm still your father. Marcus glared through his beard, afraid I would be upset. He grabbed a rolling pin and was about to hit Mason. Uncle, he's tired, let's eat first. I spoke to defuse it. After all, in a few days I'll be leaving. I just want peace, not a quarrel. I know even more that the angrier Marcus gets, the more Mason will despise me. A stubborn man like him cannot be convinced by force. Lily. Martha squeezed my hand and whispered. You have to rein that man in. Don't coddle him. What a wonderful mother-in-law, right? But it seems fate has denied us any mother-in-law/daughter-in-law bond in this life. Just as he sat down at the table, before he could pick up his chopsticks, the village loudspeaker carried the village party secretary's booming voice. Mason, the unit called, there's an emergency. I'll say it again. Mason. Hearing the broadcast, Mason sprang to his feet. I have to go back to the unit. He grabbed his backpack and walked off without looking back. It was exactly like in his past life. He hadn't even been home long enough for his seat to warm up when Rosalind called him away. Rosalind was an entertainer in the army's cultural troupe. Pretty, a singer and dancer, and able to recite poetry. She was Mason's first love. Although in my last life the term first love wasn't in vogue, Mason would have braved fire and water, climbed mountains, and crossed seas for a single word from Rosalind. After Mason left in my previous life, Marcus and Martha sent me to the military and even found the division commander to be our witness. Mason couldn't withstand the pressure and finally agreed to register our marriage so I could follow the troops. But on the wedding night Rosalind called and took him away. Then they said he had been sent on a mission. When he returned, his vocal cords and groin were both injured. He took my virginity for a lifetime. For the next 40 years my husband and I could only communicate through paper, pen, and gestures. I swallowed my tears and devoted myself wholly to caring for his daily life. I tended to my father and mother-in-law. How foolish I was. I never even considered that if he really were mute, how could he have risen from Mason to a senior officer in the military? He would have been discharged long ago for illness. In the army he could communicate perfectly well with others, giving orders and all, he just didn't bother to speak to me at home. I was always well behaved and proper, never prying into his comrades or matters of his service. That's how I was deceived for decades. Until his 60th birthday, when I was cleaning his study and found a box containing more than 500 phone cards. They were the kind used specifically for making overseas calls, IC cards. Because Rosalind later married abroad, divorced twice, and did not live well. Mason felt he had betrayed his first love, so he wanted to make amends with 40 years of tenderness. The house and cars Rosalind had abroad were all purchased by him. He wouldn't have children with me, yet he treated the 3 children Rosalind had with her 2 previous husbands as his own, paying for those 3 kids' tuition and living expenses. He even attended their weddings as the representative of the bride's family. I was kept in the dark about all of this. I never asked him where he spent the money. 100% trust yielded the coldest, most heartless betrayal. When I learned the truth, my mental world collapsed. I fell desperately from the balcony, so I was given a second chance at life. I don't want a man I can't warm back. 4 days remained before leaving for City A, and I packed my things. Being an orphan meant solitude and hardship, but the advantage was having no attachments. I could leave whenever I wanted. A few changes of clothes went into the suitcase. I stitched an inner pocket into my underwear, and inside were my ID card and 300 yuan. That was all my savings. In 1984, a city worker's monthly wage was only a little over 30 yuan. 300 yuan was absolutely a fortune. It was the condolence payment after Dad's death. I had saved it for 10 years and never touched it. In my previous life, when I married Mason, I used that money to buy him a watch. I also bought a sewing machine and a brand new bicycle and brought them with me when I followed the army. But I never once saw him wear that watch. In this life, I certainly wouldn't be the one to press my warm face against a cold behind again. That 300 yuan would be my capital for starting a business in City A. When they saw me packing, Marcus and Martha thought I was going to accompany the troops and were very happy. They wanted to see me off, but I refused. Martha then handed me 500 yuan, saying it was the Meng family's bride price. I refused repeatedly. Martha wouldn't hear of it and insisted on giving it to me. I had no choice but to accept. My father had given his life for the Meng family. I could take this money with a clear conscience. 3 days before leaving for City A, I went to my parents' grave to say farewell. Mom, Dad, I'm going to City A to throw myself into the great cause of the country's reform and opening up. Wait for your daughter to come back. Don't worry, even without Mason, I'll be very happy. Sunday arrived. I said goodbye to Marcus and Martha and left the mountain village where I had lived for more than 20 years. The green train rumbled toward City A. It was more than 1,000 kilometers to City A. 3 transfers were required, taking 3 days and 2 nights. I didn't know if it was coincidence or fate. The city where I made my first transfer was the very place where Mason's unit was stationed. I had 3 hours of free time between trains. I hadn't planned to use this spare time to say goodbye to Mason. There was no need, he wouldn't miss me. I was just eating noodles at the state guest house outside the station when, unexpectedly, I ran into Mason and saw Rosalind. In the early 80s, people's clothes came in only two colors, army green and light gray. Rosalind wore a yellow dress, which made her stand out vividly in the crowd. They were eating here too. A large bag sat beside Rosalind. It contained costumes for a performance. Apparently the troupe was going out on tour. Mason had come to see them off. Our eyes met briefly. I didn't want to speak, I planned to pretend I didn't know him. But his face, after flushing with a hint of embarrassment, quickly snapped back into an expression of complete superiority. He strode up to me. "Lily. You're getting bolder and making decisions on your own. I didn't come to pick you up. Who told you to come to the base by yourself? Do you think joining the military is child's play? There are a lot of procedures. Aren't you just making things difficult for me?" Ever since we were kids, Mason had been an exceptional person. He was a priority for development in the military, and I had always treated him as my dream man. So his confidence had slid into a touch of vanity. "Mason, I was just passing through, not looking for you." "Ha ha ha." Mason laughed mockingly. "Lily. Since when did you learn to lie? Not a single true word comes out of your mouth. A few days ago you said you weren't going to marry me. Isn't this just you chasing someone into the military again? I've told you many times. I'm building my career now, I don't want you holding me back." He was about to say more when Rosalind, soft and fragile, spoke up. "Mason, calm down outside, I'll talk to Lily. Lily hurried here exhausted to seek you out, don't let her heart go cold." Only then did Mason snort and leave the guest house. Rosalind moved closer to me, the smile vanished from her face. In a voice meant for only the two of us, she whispered provocatively. "You a country bumpkin, what right does Mason have to marry you? How dare you cling to the military and follow him there? You're shameless. Didn't you just threaten Mason into marriage with your father's death? Ha, the life of a rural peasant is worthless. Serves you right if you're dead." She was about to say more. Smack. I had already slapped Rosalind hard across the face. I had waited 2 lifetimes to deliver that one slap, so I used every ounce of my strength. 5 clear palm prints bloomed across Rosalind's pale face. In my previous life, after I joined the military, Rosalind had said almost exactly the same things. Though furious, I had held back, worried Mason would think me a shrew, so I didn't strike. In that life, Rosalind had purposely thrown herself down and accused me of hitting her. So I have to slap her in this life. Just to stop her from pretending. A look of astonishment crossed Rosalind's face. She clearly hadn't expected me to actually strike. But then delight followed, she covered her face and cried out, "Mason, she hit me." Mason rushed in at the sound. "Lily. You've gone too far. Apologize." Rosalind pressed her hands to her face, a gleam of triumph in her eyes. "In my last life I was forced to apologize." I cried and tried to explain that Rosalind had provoked me first, and I hadn't even hit her. But Mason simply wouldn't listen. He couldn't believe Rosalind would say something so vicious. Rosalind reads poetry. Shelley, Goethe, Pushkin. I refused to believe she'd be that mean. I had no obligation to explain myself this time. I couldn't eat, I stood up and left. For the first time in all these years, I defied Mason. He was already livid. "If you won't apologize, then get out of here, I won't marry a shrew like you." I stopped and turned my head. "Mason, don't worry, you won't see me again from now on." He suddenly grew a little flustered. What do you mean?" "It means what you hope it does. Fortunately we were only engaged and never got a marriage certificate, so our marriage is nullified. From now on you and I have nothing to do with each other. Don't feel guilty. Although my father risked his life to save you, you are under no obligation to marry me. Like you said, it was just an accident. My father is a good man. He would save anyone who fell into the river, he wasn't trying to extort you into marrying me. His daughter isn't that bad, she doesn't have to use tricks like this to get married." Hearing me, Mason's face showed awkwardness and shame. I didn't mean that. I'm very grateful to your father for. There's no need to be grateful. He's already dead, those words mean nothing now. I turned my head and walked into the station. Mason thought my words meant I'd been persuaded to agree to go back to the village. He sighed in relief and hurried after me. I'll see you back to the village. Give me a few more days about the troop matter. Even now, Mason still couldn't believe I was really breaking up with him. I was too tired to explain. Rosalind deliberately knocked the table over, and the noodles I had only just taken a bite of splashed all over her. Mason hurried to a stop, turning back to take care of his first love. Call me when you get home. He pulled 100 yuan from his pocket and stuffed it into my hand, then turned and ran back. I strode into the station. I told myself not to cry, but the tears fell anyway. From this moment on, you have been erased from my life. From now on, as mountains stand and waters flow, my joys and angers, my sorrows and delights have nothing to do with you. The train jolted and swayed for 3 days and 2 nights, and finally arrived in City A. In my previous life I had been to City A few times. But by then City A had already become a domestic super first-tier city, a prosperous metropolis renowned even internationally. But over 40 years ago, City A began its rise from a small fishing village. In 1984, it was precisely the most vibrant moment for City A, the time it was about to embark on a fast track of rapid development. After being reborn, I chose to come to City A to strive because this place was a paradise for entrepreneurial dreams. I walked the streets of City A. Although the streetscape at this moment was still shabby, with few tall buildings to be seen and no luxury cars crowding the roads. But the crowds were bustling, and you could hear dialects from all over the country. These were all young people who had come to City A to chase their dreams. Decades from now, many well-known big entrepreneurs and billionaires would emerge from among them. I was fortunate to become one of them. With the advantage of being reborn, I was sure I would succeed. I wouldn't waste the chance God had given me to live again. I already had a plan for what to do in City A. Although at that time City A had many factories, state-owned, joint ventures, and foreign-funded, I had no intention of going into a factory. After all, I only had a junior high school education, even being reborn wouldn't suddenly make me a scientific genius. I couldn't produce high-tech things like computers, phones, or chips. Besides, my capital was limited, only 1,000 yuan. I could only go into businesses with low thresholds and small investments, but that could still make money. The service industry. More specifically, food and beverage. Even though by this era things had opened up and people were allowed to do business, and individual industrial and commercial households were called individual households, because of mental constraints most people in society still thought being an individual household wasn't the proper path, even shaming. The best routes were still to join the army or get into a factory. Best of all to get into a state-owned factory. That was called an iron rice bowl. So private individual economies were rare. Walk down the street and, apart from state-owned restaurants, the post office, the supply and marketing cooperative and the grocery stores, you could hardly see any other shops. Take this restaurant for example, the waitstaff at state-run eateries are regular employees with formal positions. So there's simply no such thing as the customer is God or smile service. The waiters were all unbearably full of themselves. The doors were hard to get through, the faces were sour, and the words were sharp. So even if people had money in their pockets, many still wouldn't go to these state-run restaurants to eat. It's all too easy to not eat well and end up with a belly full of anger. So I decided to start my venture by opening a small snack shop. The location was chosen in Shiko Industrial Zone of City A. I counted, there were already over 100 factories here, and the workers together could number 50 to 60,000. Most of them are from out of town, mostly single, with no way to cook for themselves. Compared with the mainland, the workers here earn more. Some even make 200 yuan a month. Although many factories have canteens, once people have money they naturally want to improve their lives, eat something tasty. So the food and beverage business is absolutely a basic necessity. Besides, I had a unique advantage. After following the troops in my previous life, I worked in the military's logistics department, responsible for overseeing the canteens. The soldiers in the unit came from all over the country and liked every kind of flavor. And because there was no warmth at home and no one to talk to, my only hobby was cooking, studying the regional cuisines, signature recipes, and street snacks from across the nation. Shandong, Sichuan, Cantonese, Fujian, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Hunan, Anhui, there wasn't a cuisine I couldn't do. Hot pot, barbecue, noodles, I was skilled at them all. Even Western dishes and desserts were nothing to me. Rent was cheap in this era. I spent 150 yuan to rent a storefront on the main street, and used the rest to buy pots, pans, dishes, and ingredients. Lily Restaurant officially opened. The 1980s were a time when supply was less than demand. As long as you were bold and willing to work hard, you couldn't fail to make money. Because my restaurant could make signature dishes from all over the country, it was packed from the moment we opened. Many people who came to City A for work came to my place to eat, saying they could feel the taste of home. I was too busy to handle it alone, so I hired 2 waitstaff. The 3 of us spun like tops. After a month, although it was very hard work, the books added up. After deducting rent and the wages for the waitstaff, I netted 2,000 yuan. In 1984, what did 2,000 yuan mean? It was the equivalent of 2 years' income for a working-class family. It was 5 years' income for a farmer. I cried over the ledgers. These were tears of happiness. A woman doesn't need a man. Because a man will betray you, hurt you. But money never will. In the blink of an eye it had already been half a year in City A. The restaurant business kept getting better and better. My savings had also reached 10,000, making me a respectable 10,000 yuan household. In the 1980s that was a title to envy. It carried more prestige than the millionaires of later generations. My restaurant kept expanding. Where I had originally rented 1 shop, I now rented 3. I had 6 employees under me. I wasn't a heartless boss, I was generous with the people who worked for me. I paid them wages well above the average and gave additional bonuses. As a result, each of them was highly motivated. I was busy working in the restaurant that day when I suddenly heard an astonished voice. Lily? I turned my head and, to my surprise, ran into someone from my hometown. Lucas, the village accountant. He was in City A on business and happened to come into my restaurant for lunch. Of course I was very enthusiastic to see a fellow villager. I not only added several hearty dishes, but I also comped the meal. Lucas didn't touch his chopsticks, he looked urgent. Lily. What are you doing here? You have no idea. For the past 6 months the Meng family has been in an uproar trying to find you. Mason is about to go crazy. 6 months earlier, I boarded a train to City A. The Mengs and the villagers all assumed I was going to follow the military and go marry Mason. Later, when I changed trains, I ran into Mason and Rosalind. Mason thought so too. He sent me off again. He assumed I had returned to the village. No one knew I had come to City A. That created a misunderstanding, an information gap. The villagers thought I was in the military, and Mason thought I was back home. The first few days were calm. A few days later, when Mason still hadn't received the check-in call I was supposed to make, he phoned the village to ask. Only then did he learn I hadn't gone back at all. I had vanished into thin air. Everyone panicked. Mason took leave and began searching everywhere for me. I don't have a phone. There were no surveillance cameras in those days, and train tickets weren't linked to real names. Where would they look for me? Mason searched for a full 2 months and still found nothing. The police couldn't do anything either. So everyone assumed something had happened to me. That I must have been killed on the road. Martha cried at home every day. Marcus beat Mason's arms with a rolling pin until the bones broke. He called him a thankless wretch, cursed him for causing my death. The villagers all expressed their regret for me, saying how pitiful I was. So when Lucas suddenly saw me running a restaurant in City A, living so lively, he was stunned. "Lily! Come back with me. Everyone is waiting for you." I shook my head. "I'm not going back. I'm doing fine in City A. Please go back and tell Marcus and Martha for me that I'm fine and they needn't worry." Lucas slapped his thigh hard. "Why are you so stubborn, girl? What about Mason? Aren't you two getting married?" "No." I shook my head firmly. "He and I have been over for a long time." After Lucas left, I kept busy at the inn. The biggest inconvenience in this era, besides having no mobile internet, was that there was no online payment. Every transaction had to be done in cash. Every night after I finished work, I had to carefully count the cash I'd taken in. The next day at noon I'd go to the bank to deposit it. I couldn't keep too much money on me, lest it attract envy. But my restaurant did such a good business that it was impossible not to draw attention. That night it rained and the sky outside was especially dark. I rented a small bungalow in the alley behind the restaurant. Just as I was about to lock up the restaurant and go back to rest, a tremendous force shoved me hard. I was pushed back into the room. A sleazy-looking man slunk in with a leer on his face. He'd come to rob me. City A was full of people, some sincerely trying to start a business and get rich, others looking for illicit gains. He'd come not only to take money, but with criminal intentions toward me. "You're pretty handsome." The thug pinned me to the table, about to commit a brutal act. "Ah." I bit down hard on his hand. He leapt back, clutching the bleeding wound and cursing. "You goddamn dog." He tried to bully me further. I ran into the kitchen and grabbed a cleaver. "Don't come near, or I'll fight you to the death." The thug wasn't intimidated, it only brought out his nastier side. "Fuck. Bet you won't last against me, you little bitch." He lunged at me again. I would rather die than be defiled. Resolute in my mind, I decided that if I couldn't escape, I would kill myself. At the critical moment. "Don't move." A man in a military uniform burst in. The uniform carried an air of authority. The thug was so frightened he fled with his hands over his head. It was Mason. Although one of his arms was slung in a bandage, obviously a fracture not yet fully healed, he easily subdued the assailant with his other hand. The police arrived and took the man away. After everything was over, Mason looked at me with a complicated expression. "Lily, you made me search for you until I nearly lost my mind." Mason had come after hearing Lucas's report. "Come back with me. Everyone at home is waiting for you." I want to marry you. I've already reported about the military deployment to my superior. Stop this, I've had enough of the blame for the 6 months you vanished. His handsome face was worn with fatigue. Luckily you weren't hurt, otherwise I would never forgive myself in this life. I heard he was willing to marry me, yet I felt not an ounce of excitement or happiness. Because to me, this had already become a trivial matter. "Mason, thank you for saving me. But go back, I will not marry you. I already made that very clear to you before." Mason was half angry, half ashamed. "Lily. Don't push your luck. I've already compromised, what more do you want? Making a scene like this won't do you any good. Aren't you just jealous of Rosalind? We're innocent. We're only kindred spirits." I shook my head firmly. "I'm not playing games, I just don't want to marry you. Whether you marry Rosalind or someone else is none of my business. If you're worried you won't be able to explain things to Marcus and Martha when you go back, I'll write them a letter saying it was me who didn't want to marry you, telling them not to pressure you." Hearing me say that, across 2 lifetimes, it was the first time Mason truly believed I didn't love him. That I didn't want to be his wife. On his face there was shock, confusion, even relief. I could understand all of that. He had finally put down the heavy burden that was me. But what were the feelings of loss and reluctance about? "Do you mean it?" "Really?" I had already taken out stationery to write to Marcus and Martha. Lily, actually I'm not completely without feelings for you. I just feel like everyone says I owe you. I feel pressure, feel like marrying you is checking off a task, that's why I rebelled, didn't want to. Don't say any more, it's not important. I handed the letter to Mason. Mason, from now on we're both free. After Mason left, my life went on. Before I knew it, it was the end of the year, and I was supposed to return to my hometown to sweep my parents' graves. After struggling in City A for 9 months, I had earned 30,000 yuan. Coming back to the village now, it was definitely like returning in glory. I wore a beautiful outfit. On top was a red down jacket, and below, black knee-high boots. In the inland areas, not only did few people dress like this, many had never even seen it. Because City A was closer to City S, the clothes and styles came from there. Fashion trends were several years ahead of the inland cities. Never mind the countryside. The moment I entered the village, it erupted. Dozens of children swarmed around me. I had brought a lot of New Year gifts, just the white rabbit candies filled a whole big bag. Everyone got a share. The children were overjoyed. After both my parents passed away, many kind villagers helped and looked after me. I cannot forget their kindness. I went to their homes to give New Year red envelopes. Each envelope contained 200 yuan. That was an enormous sum, and it caused a stir throughout the village. Everyone envied that I had earned money outside and had become capable. Of course, the envelopes for Marcus and Martha were separate. Each of those envelopes contained 1,000 yuan. After all, they raised me for 10 years. Even though I could never become their daughter-in-law, I must not forget their kindness. Marcus refused the envelope no matter what, eventually he became frantic. Lily. I have no face taking your money. Our old Meng family has wronged you. Martha cried. Lily, my foolish son has no luck. I could only comfort them. It was the 29th of the Lunar New Year. Marcus and Martha insisted I stay at their house. Just then, 2 people came back in with the cold wind. Mason had returned with Rosalind to celebrate the new year. Mason just stared at me. Rosalind glared at my down jacket and knee-high boots with a look of envy so fierce it seemed to breathe fire. They've come back. Of course I didn't want to keep living in the Meng house, so as not to make things awkward for everyone. But Martha insisted I stay. She treated Rosalind like air, completely ignoring her. In the end I still moved back into my old room. Martha finally agreed to speak to Rosalind. No name, no standing, you're not allowed to share a room. We don't want people laughing at us. That night Martha put Rosalind in Mason's room, but chased Mason off to the storage shed. There was no stove in there, it was freezing in winter. Martha didn't care. She muttered under her breath, "Freeze to death, you heartless thing." That night I slept very restlessly. At first, in the middle of the night, Rosalind needed to use the toilet but refused to go to the outhouse, saying it was filthy. In the end Mason had to go out and borrow a chamber pot. Martha naturally was even less pleased with Rosalind. We're country folk, don't like the dirt? Then don't come here. Who asked you to come? Rosalind was so furious tears brimmed in her eyes. Mason couldn't hold back. Mom. Cut it out. Martha pointed at Mason. If you marry her, don't call me your mother. The matter didn't quiet down until well into the late night. The next morning, I went to the cemetery to tend my parents' graves, only to find my bright red down jacket had been slashed with a dozen large cuts. No question, Rosalind had done it. That woman had been driven mad by jealousy and had been taken advantage of by Martha, so she vented all her resentment on me. I'm fine, but Marcus and Martha were furious. Even Mason lost his temper with Rosalind for the first time. Rosalind. Apologize. How could you do this? Then he looked at me with an apologetic expression. Lily, I'm sorry, how much was this jacket? I'll pay. I shook my head. Never mind, it's not worth much. I didn't make a fuss, but Rosalind erupted into a furious roar. You country bumpkin Lily, who do you think you are? What gives you the right to wear such beautiful clothes? You deserve none of it. Heh. Who knows where your money came from? I heard a lot of shameless women go south to become streetwalkers. You must have sold yourself too. Smack. A crisp slap landed, but this time it was Mason who struck. He pointed at Rosalind. Shut up. You hit me? I hate you. Rosalind ran off in tears. Mason didn't chase her, he just looked at me with a conflicted expression. Go after them, I'm fine, I'm going to tend the grave. I left the Meng family to tend my parents' graves. That same day I left the village. Whatever story Mason and Rosalind had, I didn't care at all. In early spring, Mason came to City A again. He brought me the same style of red down jacket. He said it was compensation. I accepted it. But he refused to leave. Lily, it was my fault before, actually I still think you're. Rosalind, she's impossible. It was my fault before, I didn't appreciate my blessings. Poems can be read sometimes, not lived by. His eyes were full of guilt. Mason asked cautiously, Can we still? It's all in the past. I cut him off. He left in resignation. After that, he wrote me a letter almost every month. I never opened any of them. I just threw them straight onto the stove and burned them. In the blink of an eye it was the end of the next year. I had already opened 3 restaurants. I employed over 30 people. My annual income exceeded 100,000. When I returned to my hometown, I didn't alert anyone, I only visited my parents' graves and left that night. Because of me, some people from the village came to City A to work. I did my best to help. I heard that in 1987, Mason still married Rosalind. It was Rosalind who pushed for it. Mason never wanted to marry. Later Rosalind drugged him. Rosalind caused a scene at the regiment headquarters, and Mason had no choice but to marry her. But the two often quarreled and their relationship was poor. Rosalind also didn't get along with her in-laws. In the end Mason requested a posting on the border, the couple lived apart for long periods, and they had no children. Later it was the 1990s. I had already become the chairman of a publicly listed company. Besides restaurants, my businesses included tourism, film and real estate. After all, I had been reborn, so I naturally knew which industries were about to take off. My personal wealth had already exceeded 1 billion. But I still hadn't married. Men were boring, my career was my lifelong companion. The next time I heard about Mason was in '94. He had been dismissed. The reason was that Rosalind insisted on going abroad, saying you couldn't make much money at home and she wanted to enjoy life overseas. Mason disagreed. By then he was the chief of staff of the division and controlled a good deal of training funds. Rosalind shamelessly stole funds to get abroad. Although she was later arrested, Rosalind ended up in prison. Mason was also dismissed from the force for negligence. By then Marcus and Martha had already passed away, and naturally I had no further contact with him. Another 20 years passed, bringing me to 2024. I was 60, exactly the same age as when I was reborn in my previous life. My fortune had reached 30 billion. I was still alone, but I had done a great deal of philanthropic work. That day my assistant drove me to a charity awards gala. As we passed the underground parking lot, I saw an old security guard dozing inside, dressed in a tattered green uniform. Mason. Long time no see.